Because when people say parasitology, quite often we have a confused idea about what parasitology means. I suppose to some students they would see parasitology, certainly years ago when I studied parasitology, it was a lot about life cycles, very complex life cycles which we had to remember. And so it wasn't really the most favourite of subjects because it just seemed like there were too many intricate life cycles that we had to know. For med students, I teach third year medicine, so I teach their infectious disease people, and frankly speaking, the little bit of parasitology I give them in medicine is about all they will get for their entire career. They get no lectures on malaria, they get no lectures on toxo, they get a couple of lectures on some of the gut parasites that we find currently in New Zealand, but generally it's not really important, and it seems like a bit of a waste of time to a medic who is mainly dealing with coughs, sniffles, people dying of congestive heart failure and other problems associated with living in a Western world. As for public health officials, doctors, really people are more interested, and I know this unfortunately in all too well detail, that trying to get funding for parasitology is very, very difficult. Most people and public officials are really only interested in major pandemic type diseases these days. And the general public, well, para what? Most people don't know, and for those of you who are into movies, parasitology, well, this is a bit gross, this one, but you know, some people think of this as being a parasite, which actually, technically speaking, although it doesn't exist, is in fact most definitely a type of parasite. We'd call it technically we'd call this a parasitoid. So why is there seemingly this confusion about parasitology? Why do people from all different walks of life see parasitology in a different way? There does tend to be a general rule which explains why there is a general disinterest in parasitology in a developed country like New Zealand. And this is a general rule that we see pretty much everywhere. As the wealth and development of a country increases, it seems like the threat to parasites decreases. And certainly, in my professional experience, I've worked mostly for my 30-year-odd career, I have predominantly focused in on parasites, and the places I go to are places like the Thai-Myanmar border, or Zambia, or Papua New Guinea, or countries that don't have fully developed health infrastructures. And that's where parasitologists tend to go. So that's the general rule. And this is very much the case. I'm a frequent traveller to South Korea and Japan for a lot of my work, but I don't go there because there's parasites anymore. In fact, the heyday of their parasites was, this is South Korea in the 1950s. This is South Korea now. And the South Korea of the 1950s was a veritable parasite paradise. And just about every type of parasite you could imagine, including some that no longer exist, occurred in Seoul. But now, it's very much free of this, as to is Japan. So, why the hell am I giving parasitology lectures to third-year microbiology students in New Zealand when you probably are not going to be interested or have very little interest in parasitology, and why is it a big deal? Well, I'd like to posit to you that people are getting it wrong. I'd like to say to you that parasites do bloody well matter, and they matter in a big way, and in a way that perhaps we don't expect. And so today's lecture is in a bit of an apologetic on parasitology. So I'm going to be talking about why we should perhaps consider parasitology. It's an argumentative type of lecture, and some people may have different opinions to me, but this is my opinion, and I hope to convince you that, if not to agree with me, but certainly to consider some of these options. And in a university, that's exactly what we should be doing. The first and the most important reason why I still find parasitology important is that the king of parasites, as it is colloquially often referred to, is malaria. Malaria is a disease that still threatens a huge number of people. In fact, around 4 billion people are still at risk of infection to malaria. Now, we've known malaria for many years, and why on earth is it still a problem now? Over the last 50 years, we have produced quite a number of really important and very effective anti-malarials. In fact, just prior to the 1970s, we thought we definitely had malaria on the ropes. In fact, there was a lot of talk about the elimination of malaria in 1965. Something went wrong, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. But ever since, we have been trying to produce anti-malarial drugs. And this is what we've got for the efforts in the last 50 years. Interestingly, a large proportion of those have been made by the United States Army, which you may wonder, why is the Army so interested in malaria? And China. In fact, to be really frank, this is really the Chinese Army. Because the reason why they got into developing all of this was because of the war in Vietnam during the 1960s and 1970s. They decided that they better increase the number of types of drugs that they produce. So this was a program instituted by Mao Zedong to produce better anti-malarials for their troops who invaded Vietnam in 1979, just after the Americans left. As with all antimicrobials, unfortunately, these precious few drugs that we've developed over the last 50 years and the ones that we developed before have all fallen into disrepair. Mostly because they've been lost to resistance. Now, all of you will remember, or you should have an appreciation of what drives drug resistance. Basically, applying any kind of selection pressure to anything is going to select those who are most fit. And the same thing goes with malaria parasites. When we start applying a drug pressure in large quantities, we're going to select for malaria parasites that are not as sensitive to the drug as before. And so throughout the years, when we have developed these type of drugs, they've just suddenly started to become not very effective. Some drugs within a year of release, are no longer useful. So as we headed into the 2000s, this was the picture that was developing. All of the drugs developed by industry and the US Army were basically no good anymore. And we were left with some very, very potent and effective Chinese drugs. Now, one of the really important things I'd like to mention to you about these Chinese drugs is they're pretty much all based on this chemistry. This endoperoxide that you see here is a little oxidative bomb inside the Qinghao molecule. Now, this plant that it's from, and it's very interesting to note, is this drug is still mostly isolated from this herb. And this herb was known to Chinese scholars for about 2 millennia. They've known about artemisinin for about 2,000 years. And when these writings were first examined in the 1970s by people in China, they were looking for a type of medication, a Chinese medicine, that would cure relapsing fevers, which is what malaria causes. But back in the day, they didn't know what caused malaria. They just saw that people who got fevers every 48 hours, if they made a tea with this stuff, miraculously they would get well. And indeed, this has become pretty much the savior of malaria. Without the Qinghao drugs, the most important are artemisinin and artesunate, and also artemether, millions would have died. Millions would have died. And by the way, this deserves a whole lecture on itself, because the story behind the development of artemisinins is one of hubris and snobbery, because when this drug first came out, the officials in the World Health Organization looked down their nose at it and they didn't believe it. They didn't think that it was particularly very useful. And it took a long time to convince the World Health Organization that yes, we actually do think that this herbal-based medication is actually the best practice. And certainly throughout the world now, the use of anti-malarials is almost all to do with Qinghao or artemisinin-based medication. Every single one of these colours represents the use of this drug throughout the world. It's widely used and is absolutely essential for the treatment of malaria. Without it, we have nothing. So I was there in Bangkok in 2008 when these scientists met. I wasn't part of this publication, but I was there when the debate first occurred, because it was assumed, just like the Titanic could never sink, it was literally believed that the artemisinins could never be beaten. Because of that endoperoxide bond inside the chemistry of Qinghao related drugs, we thought that the power of this oxidative burst would completely obliterate the parasite. When this chemical goes inside the parasite, it reacts with a number of, I'll talk about it in another lecture, it reacts with a number of important parts of the malaria parasite, releasing that endoperoxide bond and basically forming an oxidative bomb inside the infected red blood cell, killing the parasite. And we just thought, it can't be true. Unfortunately, since this report, by the way, for those of you who are not familiar, the New England Journal of Medicine is the premier medical journal on earth. It's got an amazing impact factor, and it's still considered today as the most important of all of the medical journals. So for this to be published in there, it kind of gives you some sort of an insight to the importance of this particular drug. But its importance goes well beyond academia. When we first saw these cases, we saw that basically, instead of the parasite being cured in a couple of hours, those hours were being stretched out. So it wasn't a black and white, we give the medicine, it's resistant or not. It was a more subtle thing at first. It seemed like it just shifted the curve across. So instead of being cured in a few hours, it took a few more hours to cure the patient. And you might be thinking to yourself, who cares about a few hours? In my lectures on malaria, I will tell you why it really matters. Just a few hours to someone's life. This delayed clearance in artemisinin is what we call resistance to artemisinins. And we found basically that in patients who had this delayed clearance of parasites, the patients quite often died. Again, I'll tell you why in another lecture. We have a genetic basis for this particular drug resistance. And the genetic basis of it first arose here in Cambodia, on the Thai-Cambodian border. But within a few years, somehow it had magically transported itself to the Thai-Myanmar border. Does that mean that malaria-carrying mosquitoes flew all the way 1,000-odd kilometres up here? No. Does it mean that patients here had migrated up to Myanmar? Very unlikely, given the ethnic minorities that we deal with who have the drug resistance. It seemed like it was another completely new de novo event. So resistance occurring again. This spread has been inexorable, and now it's unfortunately has been found in Africa.
In the remote border region where Thailand meets Myanmar,
where does he come from?
Dr. Francois Noston is fighting to contain a drug-resistant malaria that, unless stopped here, could threaten the lives of millions.
How to beat the resistance, how to win this race, and how to eliminate the parasite before it's too late. That's our challenge now. The two patients that they have seen this morning have Vivax malaria, not falciparum.
His enemy is the malaria parasite, which is now developing resistance to what has been the frontline anti-malarial drug, artemisinin.
Day 5, he was still positive.
Yes.
Well, that's not very good. It means that it's very slow to clear his parasite, no?
Noston runs a string of clinics on both sides of the porous border, where he's identified an alarming rise in the time it takes to cure malaria.
Instead of taking 24 hours on the treatment, it takes 3 days or 4 days. That's what characterizes artemisinin resistance. We are going to see patients who don't respond to the treatment anymore, and that's the worry, because we have nothing else to give them.
There are currently no other new anti-malarial drugs that can satisfactorily replace artemisinin. The drug resistance was first spotted on the Thai-Cambodia border, and Noston is unsure whether it's spread here or is homegrown. Either way, he's worried. Resistance to just about every major anti-malarial drug has started in these porous border regions, and history shows that once that resistance has taken hold, it can quickly spread worldwide with devastating consequences. Resistance to chloroquine, an earlier frontline anti-malarial, also started here before spreading to Africa.
And we know what happens in Africa when resistance is bad. Millions of deaths. So it means that all the progress that was done in the last, say, 15 years or 10 years will be lost. Now that resistance is here, we worry that We are running out of time.
Nobody knows why the border regions are so susceptible to drug resistance.
You see all these the migrant workers.
These are
all our Burmese migrant workers who are working in the farms around here.
Though it's probably a combination of the poverty, conflict and constant movement of people.
Why is malaria affecting the growth of the baby? We don't really understand the mechanism. She was slow, but how slow?
All of which makes proper and consistent treatment a challenge. For Noston, it's become a race against time. At his border lab, scientists are working to better understand the parasite and the mosquitoes that carry it from person to person. These specimens, which are not yet infected, are quite literally hand-reared, fed in the natural way from the arm of a scientist.
Normally I feed like a cage like this one. There's
so you're
maybe 600.
600 mosquitoes on your arm?
Yeah.
That's a lot of mosquitoes.
There's lots of mosquitoes.
The problem is that the drugs that we are using do not kill the parasite the same way at every stage.
Noston carefully chronicles the DNA and life cycle of the parasite, his enemy, and the impact of drugs at different stages of its development.
If you can kill them very, very young like this, they don't have time to go develop to this big fatty one. These ones are the ones who get stuck in your brain and kill you.
His ultimate aim is to eliminate malaria completely. Noston has been working in this region for more than 25 years. He knows the enemy well, and he also knows the stakes have never been higher. Ian Williams, NBC News, Mae Sot, Thailand.
I worked with Francois. I still work with Francois to this day. Last year, I visited his labs. Unfortunately, because of the recent outbreak of hostilities between rebel forces and the Myanmar military junta, there's been a huge increase in malaria in the region. And last time I was there, I stayed in a relatively good hotel. But at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as I was having a bit of a snooze, I got woken up. 120 millimetre mortars were basically being fired about a kilometre away from where I was sleeping. And I tell you what, it scared the hell out of me. So yeah, and the problem with war is, of course, it causes more human movement, more refugees, people being packed into unhygienic areas, people being packed into places where they shouldn't be, and quite often malaria is even more prevalent. With the loss of full effectiveness of artemisinin, this is starting to look what we've got now. And pyronaridine is not particularly good for actual direct treatment of the parasite. We don't have much anymore. So the first reason I wanted to talk about was that malaria has come back. It's drug resistant, and it's still killing, and it's increasing. It was killing around 540 to 560,000 people every year. And then over the COVID era, that's increased to well over 670,000 a year dying, most of them children in sub-Saharan Africa. So, what's another reason that we should perhaps consider parasitology? Well, one of the things that you should start to consider now, and this is very much in New Zealand, but just about every country that we look properly, is that we are not as parasite-free as we think we are. And in fact, there are many parasites that are currently growing in number. This is a place in Texas where all of these diseases, particularly these three, which we thought just shouldn't be occurring in developed countries, are starting to occur. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Perhaps one of the most prevalent diseases that I have to teach in the medical laboratory science, it's one I have to give to third-year medicine students and to you guys, is this one, Trichomonas vaginalis. This is a parasite that literally infects millions of people every year. In the United States, we think there's around between 6 and 10 million new cases every year. We don't have any idea of how many Trichomonas vaginalis cases we have in New Zealand. We just don't know. And unfortunately, it's becoming a bit of an issue. I'll talk about toxo a bit later on, Trichomonas a bit later on in my lectures. By the way, I'm just overviewing these as part of the argument, and then many of these parasites in my lectures I'm going to dive into deeper, and we'll have a look at why they're so important. This one, this one, if there was only one parasite, if I was only allowed to talk about one parasite about why you should take an interest in parasitology, this would be the one. It's not even my area of expertise. But toxoplasma is perhaps one of the most scary parasites that I could possibly tell you about. And the fact that probably 40% of you are infected with it right now is even pause for more thought. And the fact that we don't know which 40% of you are, but if you've ever had a kitten in your life, you've probably been infected by this parasite. We don't know its effects or its burden in New Zealand, but what we do know is that there seems to be something going on with toxo and our brains. The fact is that we really have no idea about the impact of toxo and many other parasites in New Zealand. Every quarter or so, ESR will put out, which is the National Epidemiology Council in New Zealand, puts out lists of important notifiable diseases. I'll mention to you that each one of these in red are parasites. Giardia and Cryptosporidium are two very important parasites. Some of you would have been infected by these. But then again, we don't put a lot of the parasites that I consider important on this list. These are the ones that are considered notifiable. So if you're diagnosed with toxo, you will not appear on that because toxo is not a notifiable disease because it's just too common. Cryptosporidium, we've probably all heard of that recently. There was an outbreak, and yes, that's my ugly face. First thing in the morning, being dragged out of bed to make a comment on breakfast TV about toxo. And I got it completely wrong. And I'll talk about why I got it wrong. Because it's much more serious. But New Zealand is a major target of parasitic diseases. We don't really know their full effect, but we do see some of the things that come out of this, like unfortunate omens or some sort of harbinger of evil. When you start getting rare dolphins dying in Auckland beaches, and then when they open them up and find their brains are riddled with toxoplasma, a parasite that doesn't care as long as you've got a vertebra and you're warm-blooded, we have to start asking questions about, one, why are rare dolphins dying of a disease that originates in cats? How can it be possible that enough of infective material is being taken out into the ocean that would be at a significant concentration to cause not only the death of a few dolphins, but when we look back in history, tens of dolphins. And not only dolphins, but seals and a whole range of other marine. People should start to go, wow, if that's a problem there, what about us and being closer to the source? And I'm going to be talking to you about toxo in one of our later lectures. So strap yourself in for that one. So, the most nasty parasite of all is now wreaking havoc. We have a bunch of parasites in our very midst. Parasites like toxo, Trichomonas vaginalis. We have no idea now how many people in New Zealand are infected by these parasites, and we have really no idea of the burden on our populations. And finally, I'd like to talk to you about something that is rather odd. Now, before we talked about the general rule, increase in wealth and development and decrease in parasitological burden. But developed countries also get something else. Increases in autoimmune diseases. How many of you have friends or family who have asthma, irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, lupus? These are all terrible autoimmune diseases that affect mostly developed countries. Now, association doesn't suggest causality, but I would like to raise a few little things with you that might give you an interesting opinion on this. We know that for a parasite to live and survive inside our bodies, it must be able to protect itself. And one of the mechanisms that parasites protect themselves with is they produce a range of molecules that not only downregulate our immune system, but actually can neutralize many of the immune effectors, such as antibodies. Many parasites produce molecules like these parasites that produce a molecule which downregulates and extends the life of animals that we give them to. Now, the idea, you don't need to, we'll talk about this a bit later on. I just want you to give the idea that this is a very serious scientific discipline. This is not pseudoscience. This is not some sort of fakery. We know very well that parasites like helminths produce a range of these things, and we know that they can reduce inflammation quite amazingly. Now, there was supposed to be a slide, and it's not up there, because there is a group in, that's right, I'll talk about it in another lecture, that use hookworms, that actually infect humans with hookworms to actually treat things like asthma and Crohn's disease. So there's a group up in Wellington that actually does work on this. It seems a bit odd that we should even then call them parasites, because parasites are things that, when we look at biological definitions, basically take away from the host and give nothing in return, and also usually do harm, some sort of harm to the host. But we are now starting to come to an understanding that parasites in many cases actually help us. And in fact, even if, let's say by some miracle, someone has developed a new drug or a new vaccine that totally removes all parasites from the earth, It destroys all malaria, drug-resistant ones, takes care of toxo for us, wipes out Babesia, Cryptosporidium, Giardia. Why would we bother studying parasitology? This reason. Because parasitology is becoming a really, really amazing source of new immunotherapies. In fact, more and more that we look, even some of the most horrible and terrible diseases that we can imagine, malaria included, has been shown to protect people from autoimmune disease. As I mentioned before, I've spent 30 years traveling in really, really quite simple and, let's say, not very comfortable conditions, and living in places that most people probably wouldn't consider suitable for animals. I quite often stayed and lived in slums in places in some parts of Bangladesh and some parts of Myanmar that you go, wow, this is terrible. But then you also notice one other thing. In all the time that I've worked right throughout these countries, I've never ever seen a major burden of any of those autoimmune diseases that I've seen. And I'm not the only one. This is definitely something to think about. Why do Western countries have such a predominance of autoimmune diseases, and yet countries that seemingly are infested with parasites are not? And this is a question that we'll come back to more and more, and I think it's something that will really be an important topic for the future. So yes, in answer to my rhetorical question, yes, I do believe that parasites are worth studying. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, parasitology does have a perception problem. A lot of people don't understand it, and even when I'm talking to the media, I know very well when I was talking to them about Cryptosporidium, they were constantly asking me about the virus or the bacteria. And I had to say to them, it's not a virus or bacterium. It has a specific type of biology that's very distinct from these, and because they are eukaryotes just like us, they're very difficult to treat.